Well, what's happening in the classroom is that how can we teach someone to a different method of reading when they had not gotten nutrition, okay? When they are struggling mentally and physically at home, they're going through emotional distress. Um, what about the students who or the schools that don't have reading coaches to support the students who did not necessarily have um, you know, learning how to read early on in their academic career, so they're behind. And I think as we talk about, policy, we forget to look at those things, right? We just see data and we see students as numbers without actually recognizing the student experience.
Welcome to The Fair Share, a series where we have candid conversations about school funding in the South. I'm your host, Juliana Hoover Potash, and this series is part of Southerners for Fair School Funding, an initiative powered by EdTrust-Tennessee that supports advocates across the region to build a movement to fairly fund every school. Last episode, we sat down with Dr. Russ Wigginton at the National Civil Rights Museum to talk about the ways that history shapes the current systems that we experience. And today we're going to dive into the lives and experiences of students who are going to tell us from their perspective why funding is important and how they are engaging in advocacy on this topic. So thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to hear your stories and uplift your experiences. So to kick us off, I wonder if you could all introduce yourselves, just share a little bit about you and why education matters to you. So, Kaleb, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can kick you off. And before I begin, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me. My name is Kaleb Sy. I'm a sophomore here at Columbia University, pursuing a Bachelor's of Arts degree in political science. Go Lions! Originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I graduated from East High School back home. So, go Mustangs! I guess what drew me to education advocacy was really early on in my educational career. I was a STEM kid before I became a politics and law kid. I was a robotics kid. So Vex Robotics, all those good things. I was that kid, and so we would often go out to different competitions in the municipalities in the more well-off areas, if you will, back home in Memphis and in Shelby County. And I would begin to just see how their school district and their facilities were way much better than mine. I began just to do a comparative analysis, well, why do they have, good AC? Why do they have good desks? Why do they have better classrooms? And what dictates who gets to have a 21st century first-rate education? And I began to see that, it was more deeper than the initial questions that I had for my parents and my friends at school. And so that's what really sparked my interest. Was really, going out outside of my zip code and really seeing how the other half lives and comparing how the other half lives to my own life. And that is what really sparked my educational advocacy.
Thanks for sharing, Kaleb. Jordan, you want to go?
Sure. Very excited to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm Jordan Madden. I'm currently a senior fourth year student at Georgia State University. So I live here in Atlanta. Go Panthers, the Dirty Teams. And I also grew up in DeKalb County, Georgia, as well as Clayton County, Georgia. So that's where I went to school and graduated from Mount Zen High School. So go Dogs. And for me, education, similar to Caleb's story, I was also that STEM kid, very nerdy. I also did robotics, did the Lego League and all of those things. And it was really a great experience. And in high school, right? Um, Things in my life began to develop that I needed additional support than the resources that my school district had. But what I learned within the education system is the support of community that you have around you. At every single point of my career, whether that was a elementary school kid, middle school, or high school kid, there was a teacher, a counselor, a parent in the community who was, not my own family, who saw and treated me like family. And whether it was tutoring support, lunches and school meals that may have not been provided by our school district, transportation, and various amounts of things. It's really what I needed to be successful as a student. And without those resources, I don't know that I could say that I would be a college student, about to graduate and begin my master's program, something that will set my family up for generations to come. Um, and school education is very important in that regard. We can build that support, and it doesn't just matter, what school or district you're a part of, what zip code you live in. Each school should have those types of supports where we have counselors, where we have teachers who can provide those resources, lunches and transportation, so that all students can have an opportunity to succeed.
I can go next. I'm Luisa Sanchez. I am a junior in high school in Central Kentucky, Boyle County High School to be more specific. And I've been very passionate about education justice ever since I was a freshman in high school, just with my background as a student immigrant who came to the US at 7 years old with a family who came to this country specifically in order to have better educational opportunities. I've always seen my time here as precious and also as like something that being involved in advocacy for me is a way of giving back to my community and of supporting my community, not only me, but also like representing other students around me. And I believe educational reform is really a good way in order to have economic development in society and also build community and build better relationships. So overall, education is very dear to my heart. And I've been involved in various efforts when it comes to educational reform in my state, but also advocating for better school funding is something that I recently did in November when we were attacked with vouchers in our state. We won that battle and we became victorious, and so we did defeat vouchers here in Kentucky, which was great. But yes, my time here in Kentucky has definitely been very rocky at times, especially within the educational system. However, even though I am a rural student, I'm very grateful for my school, and they are decently funded. However, looking at the disparities between like a school that is just 8 minutes away from me and just seeing also the diversity rates, how all of that intersects, it has all been very, very stark and very something that I've gained a lot of knowledge in, and it makes me even more passionate to advocate for those around me.
Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. I feel you've already sort of given us a sense of where we're going to go in this conversation, which is awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about your personal experiences and when you first knew that school funding was impacting you in a real way. A lot of the conversations that we see around school funding are really dominated by, policy experts, and we talk a lot about math and numbers and revenue streams and line items and all these kinds of things that can make it sound really, really dry, either boring or inaccessible or something like that. But we know that at the end of the day, all of these dollars have an effect on real students, real teachers. And so that's what we want to talk about next, is to make this more personal, so that people who aren't in your shoes can imagine what it's like to be in your shoes. So you all already shared sort of a big picture view of why education and school funding matters to you. So I wonder if you can share maybe a specific story or a specific moment that comes to mind that really illustrates for you why this issue is important. Jordan, I don't know if you want to go first to just share any specific story that comes to mind.
Yeah. For me, really, understanding from a very young age the effects of not having adequate funding in schools was very prevalent. You would be in the lunch line and, you punch in your lunch number as a little kid and you get your lunch. And that's how we always understood it. We didn't really think about the why or how it came to be or where the funding came from until you were that kid who got handed the envelope that said that you had a school balance. And to be that kid to get handed an envelope, knowing that school was the only opportunity that you had to get lunch, to get breakfast. I come from a very large family. And with a very large family, that means there's a lot of mouths to feed. And sometimes it's very hard. My mother's a single mother, and she did the very best she could to be able to provide for all of my siblings. There's 8 of us total. It's a very big family. Um, and sometimes the meals that we really needed the most happened at school. We got them during the school year, and during the summertime, we would still go to the school and get provided those meals. So it's a different feeling to then say that, well, today you can't get a meal until you pay this balance that you didn't know you had. And to look at, my mother and see that it wasn't just a balance that looked very small to me. It was a balance for me and the rest of my siblings. And as you go through middle school, you begin to see other things, wondering why textbooks didn't have information that was more current and recent. I mean, decades, right? You begin to go to high school, and the conversation is, you can go to college, but we began to have these conversations on why it's so important to do well, because people who look like me, people who went to schools like me, like mine, our families could not afford to go to the best colleges, the best universities, unless we did all of these other things. And so I think, that personal experience helped me to realize that it's important because I made it, but there's so many of the people who I went to high school with who didn't have an opportunity to go to college because they couldn't afford it. There are folks I went to middle school with who uh, didn't necessarily get the resources that they need with learning disabilities and all of the things that they had that they just couldn't continue. And that hurts my community. And so it's very important to me that we talk about, we emphasize, and we continue to push for education funding so that every single student, regardless of where they are, what school they go to, what needs they have, they can have that opportunity to do that. And that everybody can be in my shoes and walk across the stage to say that I have made it. I've done better for my family, for my community.
I love that, especially the way that you're pointing out how things that are funded in school are not just teachers, and also that students come to school with different needs. And if we're really serious about education being a way that people can chart their own path, set goals for their success, and then reach their goals no matter where they're from or what resources they grew up with, we have to be really serious about sending funding to schools so that the schools can provide those kinds of supports. Anybody else want to share something?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. Um, and I think that my story, it's very remarkable. Oftentimes, when I tell people, especially when I approach these conversations, they often see, the suit and tie, they often see the accolades, but like I tell people, you just don't know the story. For instance, like, I don't come from, very well off or connected family or things of that nature. I come from Memphis, unfortunately, one of the poorest urban cities in the South. And, also, I went to an elementary school, Scenic Hills Elementary School, where we had, every time it rained, we had to put, essentially water buckets in the hallways or even in the classrooms. We had dilapidated windows and dilapidated infrastructure where the windows, you couldn't get natural sunlight in them. And, for context, my mom and my uncle and, a few of my family friends, they went to the same elementary school. I think 20 to 30 years ago prior to me going there, and they had the same windows that they had at that time
Wow.
that I did when I went. And so I guess to answer the question, directly, I really began to see how school funding really played a part was really, really very early on. People were saying that, oh, it's not about, race, it's not about income. But I mean, when you see the implications and you see, the sort of stratification between, poor people and affluent people and black and white people, like I tell people, if it cracks like a duck, and if it sounds like a duck, then maybe just be a duck. So just call it what it is.
Yes.
Call a spade a spade. And so, when I began to see those things, and when I began to see, especially like in high school, going to a Title I school, although I went to East High School, which was probably one of the more better performing high schools in Shelby County and in West Tennessee, we still had our struggles as well. Students struggling with mental health. people struggling with substance abuse, people struggling with, food insecurity. We still had those problems as well. And so, just to see how, like I said, those things really fell along racial lines. The municipalities, they didn't have to deal with having, children come to school, experiencing a loved one get shot, unfortunately, or seeing, a mother get, beaten by their father. They didn't have to experience those things, but that was unfortunately the everyday stories of my classmates and people who look like me and who come from where I come from.
Yeah, so first, when we first arrived in this country, we actually lived in New York. And so all throughout my 4.5 years there, I do remember my family lived off of stamps from the government, and at school, I never had to worry about food because it was completely free. And so I was very grateful for all of those resources. But then it was always a sense of like, well, people who bring back bagged lunch, those are the rich kids and those are the kids who are better off. And so there was always this sort of divide. And just knowing that I didn't have to put in my pin or really do anything just because I knew that um, I had the necessity. So sometimes I did feel a bit insecure about that. However, I got through it. And then I also remember when it came to funding field trips in elementary school, it was always like a big group thing. We always sold chocolate bars or asked our family members or asked the community around us. So it was never like we were handed anything. It was always, if we want to take this opportunity, then we have to work for it in some way and contribute to funding it in some way as children, you know. So I do recall that. And even though it did build community, it also limited the opportunities that we got just because the cost of field trips, especially in a city like New York, it was very costly. So yeah, and then coming to Kentucky, the environment was very different. Um, I still remember just getting free or reduced lunch at school. However, I do see like when it comes to field trips, I've been able to acquire scholarships. And also, the district here is I'm a rural school. They are very generous when it comes to funding things that are academically based, like academic field trips. And we have a robust arts program that is also very well funded, which I'm a part of. And so I've seen those like differences in between just living in an urban area and now living in a more white, wealthy, rural area. But yes.
Something I'm so struck by in all of your responses is sort of painting a 360-degree view of why the money is important. I think a lot of the times, especially in policy conversations, we really get bogged down in basic instruction. Not that that's a bad thing. Obviously we care about literacy, mathematics, the reading, writing, arithmetic of education that goes back to the beginning of our school system. But a lot of the things that you all highlighted are things that have to do with basic needs, right? Nutrition, and also enrichment activities like field trips and the robotics and these additional things that elevate your experience, that round out your experience, and that also help you think about your future, right? What do you wish policymakers, and I use that word broadly to just mean, people who have decision-making authority, whether that's someone in a school district, a legislator in your state, a governor, anything like that. What do you wish policymakers understood about the student experience or about your experience when it comes to resources? Do you feel like there's anywhere that they are not connecting the dots or they're misunderstanding what the actual experience is for a student living their life right now?
I'll start by saying, um, you know, living within that experience is very important. And as a public policy major, I'm reminded of how important it is to have policymakers who look and have actually experienced all of these various things. Um, One thing here in Georgia, the top of the mind conversation that we're having in education is updating our quality basic education formula, which is how the state funds education here in Georgia. And it's decades old. It hasn't had an update in 40 years. And over the last 2 decades, it's been severely underfunded. In the way that we look at school funding here, majority of it coming from local areas, the state has constantly given less and less and less money. And then we do these legislative items and we bring forth bills to say, let's do you know, um, the science of reading and to do all of these various parts of things. And they're great and they pass. And then we find that some of these things work and some of them do not. Well, what's happening in the classroom is that how can we teach someone to a different method of reading when they had not gotten nutrition, right? When they are struggling mentally and physically at home, they're going through emotional distress. What about the students who or the schools that don't have reading coaches to support the students who did not necessarily have um, you know learning how to read early on in their academic career, so they're behind. And I think as we talk about policy, we forget to look at those things, right? We just see data and we see students as numbers without actually recognizing the student experience. Um,
And I also wanted to ask something that you talked about, Juliana, concerning funding as well. I also think that, I guess, in addition to funding, I think what, of course, school districts need is also wraparound services as well. And I think that that's sometimes often left out of the conversation because I think we harp on the, I guess, the obvious, fruit on the tree is, of course, the dollars and cents of things. To your question, um, concerning what would I say to government officials specifically back home in Tennessee, I think it's just simple, and it could be summed up in one sentence: stop treating education like it's an economic marketplace. I think we see this all the time. We saw it with school vouchers. We saw it with a failed achievement school district. Um, you know, when we saw with ESSER funds, which was the federal funds that, of course, the Joe Biden administration passed under COVID. We saw. I can't speak for Metro Nashville, the school district up in Nashville in Davidson County, but I can definitely speak for Memphis Shelby County schools in Shelby County. That when we got those funds, we were a level 5 school district by the Tennessee Department of Education's metrics. With those additional funds, we were a level 5 school district for the past two education cycles. Um,
And just for anybody who doesn't know, that level 5 is basically the top level for growth in academic achievement. So if you're a level 5 school, you are meeting and exceeding the hopes for closing achievement gaps and academic growth year over year, right?
I think it just goes to show that when public schools are given the adequate resources and funds to educate children, they perform well, period. And the ESSER funds were a testament to that. So I think that, and I wrote an op-ed a couple of years, I think like 2 years, going on now 2 years back, that, let's just stop reinventing the wheel for education, right? When you give public schools the adequate funding along with the rapid resources, they can perform. I'm not all for throwing money at issues, at failed solutions, but instead giving it to the hardworking teachers out in Tennessee who are having to work 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. When we pay, when we spend more on a prisoner and imprisoning someone instead of actually giving money to these teachers, it's sad. It's sad in the state of Tennessee. So if we could just do those things, things that should be using Republican terms, common sense, I think we can move better and forward as a state.
Yeah, I think as a student, if there would be something that I think policymakers should focus on is the needs of their communities living in a rural community. So I think policymakers should really tailor their advances and tailor their policies to really look at what their communities need, especially with the example of vouchers right now. Even before the 1989 Rose decision, which mandated that Kentucky's educational system was unconstitutional, therefore they set 7 Rose capacities because the schools were being underfunded. Now these schools are even more underfunded than when the court dictated that it was unconstitutional. Yet they decided that they were going to, a vast majority of them decided that they were going to support vouchers, which would drain these public schools even more. And even though we did defeat them, just looking at that whole fiasco really goes to show that we need to continue fighting for our public schools, and policymakers should get to know public schools better and our needs better, because truly it's not just about funding. It's about all capacities rose, and it's about us not getting the adequate education that we deserve and that we are constitutionally deserving of as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Luisa, you tied that bow so neatly, that funding isn't just about funding. It's about all of the hopes and aspirations that we have for students in our communities. So I want to transition us to talking a little bit about your own advocacy experiences, which I can tell that the advocate in you is so strong because it's already come out in the conversation we've had so far. But we do this work through Southerners for Fair School Funding, looking at 10 states in the South as a region. Every state is different. Jordan, you mentioned the quality basic education funding system in Georgia. It has some strengths. One big weakness is it doesn't provide any additional funding for students from low-income backgrounds at all, which most other states do. In Kentucky, you don't have any vouchers, partly because of the advocacy of the Kentucky Student Voice Team and other organizations, which is amazing. But you're now engaging in this lawsuit because just the level of funding is insufficient. And in Tennessee, we did a big funding reform a couple of years ago in 2022 that is funneling dollars a little bit more effectively than before, but we're now introducing a voucher program, and we also have room for improvement in the way that we target those dollars to students. So every state is in a unique position. Every state has strengths and room for improvement. So I want to talk about the way that you all have engaged in your own state contexts. So Luisa, maybe since you were just talking about the lawsuit, we can start with you. Can you share a little bit more about the Rose Revival campaign? What is your role in the campaign, and what outcomes are you hoping for as a result of this work?
Yes, so I am a plaintiff in the litigation work that we're doing and in suing the state. But I'll start with our Rose campaign. The work began, I want to say in October of 2023, we held our first community forum just to flesh out whether or not Kentuckians' right to an education was being fulfilled. And so we went all across the state hosting forums, speaking with community members, with students, with educators. And then with all of that, we created our State of Schools report that is already out. But at the time, we saw that there was a big deficiency in these capacities and that these capacities were not being met. So we decided to take legal action. We have student.
Can you say more about what are the capacities for those of us in states that don't have something like the 1989 Rose decision? Talk us through what those capacities are.
So the 7 Rose capacities were set forth by the court in 1989, and these capacities are based on what students should get in order to obtain an adequate education, such as proper arts education, proper civics education, as well as being able, measuring up to students from other areas, being able to compete with them. So it was not just about funding, even though that was a really big part of it. It was also about making sure that the education that these students were getting really prepared them to be citizens, and to be active members in their community, through obtaining knowledge that was just beyond the basic science and reading and math. It was really very holistic, and it adhered more also, for instance, one of the capacities, students should be able to know about their cultural heritage and their cultural roots, which may seem like something that is not as necessary in order for students to succeed academically, but it's a big part of who they are, and it impacts the way that they interact with their community. So that's just one example of that capacity. But yes, since they were not being met, we decided to take legal action and sue the state of Kentucky. On January 14, we held our press conference, and we have recently have heard back, but we are still, right now we are prepping for hosting public hearings across the state in which we really want to look at mostly like the remedies in education system. So really asking community members to think through actionable solutions, because even if we do win the case in the years that are coming, there is not a clear solution on how the funding will be placed and what programs will be created because of the lawsuit. Like none of that is clear. So we really have to decide, okay, how are we going to actually make impact, and how are we going to try to reform the education system so that this funding is not just, for instance, like concentrated in a specific like power of or in education, really looking at engaging everyone in the community, students, educators, and experts alike, in order to really think through solutions. So that's our next step. But yes, it was a really I want to say it was a very energizing commitment, just because even as a plaintiff, coming into Kentucky, I was not really given uh, the proper opportunities in order to excel as a student. I really had to learn how to advocate for myself. So becoming aware that that should not have been the case. Schools and the environment around me should have been more accommodating for me. So being able to really stand up and join in this coalition, in this movement, has been um, has been something that I've been really enthusiastic about, and in a way it has been healing for me. So yes, me and alongside so many Kentucky students, we are all joining in and fighting for a more adequate education in our state.
Your work is so energizing to watch. Coming from your neighbor state in Tennessee, seeing the work that you all are doing is really inspiring. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to go check out the Kentucky Student Voice team, go learn about the lawsuit. The students are they're really leading the way. And I'll note that lawsuits are a really powerful ingredient for change. That was part of the Tennessee story too, is there was a lawsuit that was set to go to trial, and before it went to trial, the governor and the Department of Education announced that they were going to go ahead and just reform the funding system. So lawsuits can be really powerful when you're trying to create change at the state level. Let's see. Kaleb, I know you have been involved in all kinds of different advocacy related to vouchers, school funding in Tennessee. Can you share a little bit about your experience there, and what's a major takeaway that you have from your own student advocacy?
I don't know if any Columbia student will be watching this, but if they are, they know that I always talk about Tennessee. I always talk about, well, back home in Tennessee, that's how I almost start every sentence when I'm talking to people. I would always come back to Nashville with the Education Trust team with their Days on the Hill. And so I went back last year, and also we held a rally with Tennessee for All on the steps of the Tennessee State Capitol. Of course, denouncing, we called it the voucher scam, the school voucher scam, the lead voucher scam. And so, of course, I spoke with a lot of community members. So I was able to see some good friends from, of course, Tennessee, and also Nashville, and also from really all around the state, coming together on the steps of the Tennessee State Capitol to denounce school vouchers. And I think, my message, I think, has really always been strategic planning, especially in the state of Tennessee. We sort of saw, how the courts, specifically the Tennessee State Supreme Court, has, of course, stripped down, the appellate court's decision when it came down to the private school voucher program when it was in the pilot phase. And the court, I believe, ruled that, of course, that the plaintiffs, which was, I think, a couple of mothers, concerned mothers from Memphis, Shelby County schools in Metro Nashville, that they did not have standing. So I guess my message will be to the lawyer and to the legal community. I know the ACLU or the NAACP is probably war gaming right now to try to see if they can try to rule this unconstitutional through the courts.
Thanks for sharing that, Kaleb. Jordan, I know you have also been involved in all kinds of different advocacy efforts from high school to now. Can you spotlight what has been maybe a top most meaningful advocacy experience for you, and what you feel you gained from it, or what you feel is a difference that you made for other students because of it?
Yeah, so Georgia's one of those states that does have a voucher program. And I think, our voucher program um, could have been a whole lot worse than what it is now. And I think it took a lot of students, and including myself, um, doing various forms of advocacy, right? There's this level of expectation that if Georgia legislators just kind of put together a plan, push it through the legislature, pass it quietly, and let the governor sign it, that no one will notice. And we'll wake up years down the line and say, when and how did this happen? But I think for me, and my peers in the state, students across the state, began to recognize that this space did not have student voices in it. And that's very important when we talk about education, particularly K through 12, is, where are the students? And so we began to show up, right? It was a surprise to see students at 8, 9, 10 a.m. in the morning, the Education and Youth Committee hearing. When we're supposed to be in school and we're supposed to be in class, we decided that showing up for our priorities are more important to us than being in class. And legislators, they began to see that and they began to respond. So we did things like, have press conferences. And one thing that they were very nervous about was actually go and meet with legislators. Uh, and I remember seeing in my advocacy when I wasn't able to vote, and that was very important to me, is that though I am not a voting member of your district, I am a constituent. And I wanted you to, talking to legislators to fight for us in these regards. And I talked about the QBE funding formula. And as Juliana actually, references that we don't have a weight in our funding formula um, that funds students who live in poverty. Uh, And so you see the discrepancy between different schools across Georgia and what they get from their local governments through property taxes, which is a direct line between how much money do the people in your neighborhood have and how well funded your schools would be, and the state providing dollars to support that. And we began to see things that emerged that really helped us in our advocacy as we move forward, and hopefully, next session, as we continue this conversation, that we can add a funding weight for students living in poverty. Was that this wasn't just an urban issue; that rural school districts in Georgia were also um, facing the same thing, right? This wasn't just a black and white issue. The students across the state were finding these same discrepancies within their funding formula. Was that they didn't have school districts didn't have dollars for transportation, and that they were scraping every single last penny that they could to find those things. They were finding that they had more students continue to have more personal issues as well as academic issues than they had counselors. Um, we began to see that students were sharing and schools were sharing school nurses, and nurses were floating within the district just to be able to provide the resources. And we saw the direct relationship between the dollars that they were being funded and those issues. Things like what's the student to counselor ratio? How many school buses do they have? Do they run on time? How many students qualify for free and reduced lunch and things of that nature? And we began to have these conversations. At the same time, in Georgia, they were passing voucher programs or beginning to ramp up this effort to pass vouchers like we saw in other states. And so our advocacy efforts have been to tell those conversations. So we've been pulling students from various districts across the state, particularly in rural and Republican districts, so that they can hear from their students who are saying, yeah, our school has trailers in the back, and we're having class out of these trailers while there's current construction that has been going on for various years happening in our schools. Um, we, walk to school, or we have to share bus routes, right? Our bus driver comes and picks us up here and then goes picks up another route, right? Or we may get, dropped off home very late in the evening because our bus driver's doing various routes. Or we don't have counselors to be able to support the needs that we have in schools. And those conversations eventually led to us talking more and more about it. And so the good thing is that we've got a lot of Republican support at the state level, in terms of putting this weight into um, into the QBE funding formula.
If you had 30 seconds to tell someone what's the one thing they should be taking away from this conversation today, what's the one thing you want them to take away from the discussion that we've had about student experiences related to school funding and your own advocacy? What's that thing?
I would say that it truly does take a village. It's not just about the policymakers. It's not just about the educators or just about the administrators. It's about all people being engaged and supporting schools and supporting public education, all community members, parents, students, everyone. It takes a village.
I would say that students know best, right? Students know the experiences that are important to them and the resources that they need, and that we should listen to our teachers, listen to our students, um, and those who are within the system, to better bolster and support these efforts that we have. And that policymakers should not just be sitting in their office, sitting on Capitol Hill, sitting wherever they are, kind of making these decisions, but they need to be proactive, uh, and go out and actually have these conversations with them. And that students, don't be afraid to get involved. It takes a little bit of effort. It takes a little bit of confidence. It takes a little bit of, um, uh, just a little bit of going out on the limb. You know, going above the fear, to actually do those things. But in the end, you're not just supporting yourself as a student. There are other peers, younger students behind you, who would like to also thrive on these opportunities as well.
And I can go last. My message, my 30-second piece to legislators, it will definitely be, I'm often reminded of my grandmother. She always tells me this, and has really been a shining star and I guess a guiding light for me, is care for the least of these. Everyone does not grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth or a gold spoon, or even a spoon at all. And so I definitely echo what Jordan was saying, definitely going out listening to people, but just caring for the least of these. Really, really considering the actions that we take in our bills and in our policies and even our language and everyday discourse does have implications for the least of these. If you call yourself a Christian, you should care for the least of these. And that's my message to Tennessee legislators.
Thank you all so much. On that note, I'm going to challenge all of our listeners, after hearing this conversation, to go talk to a student in your life. Go talk to a student that you know and ask them what experiences they're having in school. Do they have the resources they need? Do they see their peers having the resources that they need? And next time that you start thinking about dollars going to schools, don't envision a spreadsheet. Instead, envision a student and the life that they're living and the things that they have access to as a result of that funding. So thank you for being here and being part of this conversation. I also want to encourage folks that if you were inspired or maybe confused by all of the amazing expertise that these students have about how funding formulas work and what the money does and how it goes, that is going to be what we talk about in our next episode. We're going to break down what fair funding really means from a policy perspective and get into some of the nitty-gritty. So these students could teach a masterclass on that for sure. So if you're curious about how all of those things work and the nuts and bolts, you can come back for our next episode. And so with that, I'll thank everyone for joining us for the Fair Share and encourage everyone to visit our website, fundsouthernschools.org, where you can learn more about how states in the South fund their schools and opportunities for growth. Thank you.